For today's star review, we are going to be focusing on the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. Now, we're going to kick it off with the Roaring Twenties, which was one of those fun, crazy, free-spirited decades. And the top paragraph on this page really gives a great summary of the changes that we see take place in the 20s. The 1920s, or post-World War I era, from 1919 to 1929, was an era of major turning points and transformations. This is the time when the U.S. becomes more urban than rural, more industrial than agricultural. This is the beginning of mass modern culture, the beginning of the automotive age, the isolationist era. This is the first era with a significant number of African Americans leaving the South. It's also an era filled with cultural conflict. So much change was both exciting and difficult, and many opposing viewpoints faced off. You can think of boxing gloves. My little boys, they love playing these rock'em sock'em robots. So there was so much change so quickly, you're going to see some division in the culture of the 20s. And that's what this first slide is looking at. So we're going to kind of break this down just a little bit. You're going to see traditionalism versus modernism. And y'all know what those concepts means, traditional and modern. Under traditionalism, we see the cult of the car. The Model T Ford by Henry Ford takes off and the automotive industry booms, and traditionalists are going to see that as more of a negative thing because of the independence that it gives the teenagers, leading to kind of some more teenage rebellion, teenage promiscuity. So they kind of were not a fan of that. When we're talking about the traditionalist side of the 20s, who are we talking about? We're talking about the quote unquote respectable middle upper class. Now, the flip side of that would be modernism. Remember that the culture of the 20s was also known as the Jazz Age. We're looking at speakeasies. Remember, Prohibition was in full force. So you had illegal bootleg liquor, bathtub gin, all of those concepts going on. You had flappers, you had women challenging traditional stereotypes of how women were supposed to dress and act and participate in society. You had the 19th Amendment, which was women's suffrage, that kicked off the decade, and women were voting for the first time. And we talked about the culture of the car. Teenagers could go and leave and be independent and get into trouble. And that created a whole different dynamic in families. We also had this idea of carpe diem, seize the day, just this very free-spirited attitude of the 20s. So I want to add a little annotation right here. You had this seize the day attitude. Because of World War I and global pandemic. Yes, we can relate to this. The previous decade, from 1914 to 1918, had been World War I, and then also starting in the late 1917, 1918, there was a global pandemic of Spanish flu, and they were wearing masks all the time and isolated, just like what we can relate to. And so when that ends, the 20s kicks off, they had a lot to celebrate. They wanted to kind of cast that off, seize the moment, live life to the fullest because of all the things they had endured the previous decade. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald is a book written during the 20s, basically just about that culture of the 20s. And I think a lot of you get to read that book in English class. Another concept of modernism was illustrated by the Scopes monkey trial, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the lesson. But this idea of traditional religion versus new science literally put on trial. In the 20s, we're also going to see the rise of movie stars and heroes. Now, this concept of movie stars and heroes is very familiar to us in today's culture because we're used to having those figures. But in the 20s, it was the birth of that mass modern culture. And so it was the first time that there were celebrities. that people looked up to. Now, the one you will need to remember for your STAR test is a man named Charles Lindbergh. He was an American who flew his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, across the ocean from New York to Paris. And he was the first to cross the Atlantic Ocean on a solo flight. And that skyrocketed him to international celebrity status. And he, of course, was super famous here within the United States. One of the other conflicts that we see in the Roaring Twenties was between rural and urban life. So life out in the country or life in the big city. And so some things you would see defining rural life in the 20s would just be that agricultural farm life, simple stuff, less free time, more time working. They tended to be more religious. They were pro-prohibition. They favored horsepower over modern engines like cars and modern machinery. They still had little to no electricity. And they feared the loss of, quote, American culture, kind of the traditional values and way of life that had defined America up to the Roaring Twenties. Life in the cities was the opposite of that. It was very industrial, lots of consumerism, buying all of the latest trends and fads and new inventions that flooded the market in the Roaring Twenties. Instead of focusing on traditional Bible beliefs, they focused on science and the new ways of thinking, like eugenics, that were coming out during that time period. They were anti-prohibition, focused on the nightlife, like electrified city at that time, all the lights and sounds and things. And in the city, they were exposed to multiple cultures as opposed to in the rural areas. Now, another thing that we are going to see is a clash between Black Americans, immigrants, and then the nativist beliefs of the white population of the United States. Now, this is some of the issues to deal with prejudice and racism, but also kind of has rippling effects to this as well. So we are going to look at the culture of Black America during this time period. Now, we talked about the Great Migration earlier in one of the geographic map that y'all did. Now, the Great Migration is significant. We mentioned it earlier. It is the first time African Americans left the South in large numbers. And that is going to be a significant population shift. We also are going to see the Harlem Renaissance, the culture of Black America become mainstream America culture through jazz music and through the poetry and the songs of that time period. Tin Pan Alley, they're also in New York. Famous musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, famous poets like Langston Hughes, who is the voice of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, white America during that time, these would be people who did not consider themselves immigrants. We're kind of looking at those WASP identity, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. These are going to be like second and third generation families that have been here. They consider themselves native born Americans because they were born in the United States. And so this concept of nativism is going to play out, that because they were born here, that they somehow had a greater right to have a say in what was going on in the culture at that time. There was xenophobia, fear of foreigners, the Red Scare from the beginning of communism in the Soviet Union during this time, where they were searching for communists everywhere. The Palmer raids were a big part of that search for communism. The National Origins Act, which limited immigration for the first time. And sadly, the KKK rose to its greatest height during this time period. The last thing we're going to look at on this screen is down at the bottom, the uniting forces. There were some things that didn't change in the 1920s. And so these are some of the concepts that remained the same, good or bad. Some of those things were that overall, the United States continued to be a society that separated race. We will still see the Jim Crow laws during this time period. Still supported traditional gender roles despite the 19th Amendment getting passed, despite women getting the right to vote, and the rise of the flappers challenging those traditions. Most Americans were nativist or xenophobic and heavily influenced by religious ideas. Challenges were made, rebellion occurred, but culture remained dominant within these different themes. One of the other things during this time period was that the United States was very isolationist. After World War I, we kind of wanted to mind our own business for a little while and stick to kind of what was going on in our own country as opposed to getting involved around the world. All right, here's our vocabulary review of key terms and people of the Roaring Twenties. Now, on this slide, a couple that we might want to highlight are the phrases return to normalcy and Teapot Dome. Those had both to do with President Warren G. Harding. And what you probably could remember about him is that there were just lots of scandals during his presidency, the biggest being Teapot Dome. Return to normalcy was his campaign slogan. We went over flappers, the Jazz Age, Harlem Renaissance, Prohibition, you should know, the 21st Amendment. Of course, you need to know the amendments. Hopefully, you have been studying them. I'm going to put a little star by that one just to make sure there's emphasis there so that you know that. Now, I said we would come back to the Scopes monkey trial down here, and so I'm going to add an annotation for that. The Scopes trial was known as the trial of the century. And if you remember when we studied it, this was John Scopes, and he was the PE teacher. He subbed in a classroom one day and basically taught a lesson over biology. And the theory of evolution was taught in that lesson. And so they put that on trial. Essentially, this trial is religion or traditional religious beliefs versus modern science. And so it wasn't so much, John Scopes breaking the law in the state of Tennessee that he had taught evolution in a classroom. What was really on trial was science itself. And remember, we talked about this clash of modernism versus traditionalism in the Roaring Twenties, and this was very evident in the Scopes monkey trial. And so it became hugely sensationalized, lots of media attention. In the end, Scopes was found guilty, but his conviction was overturned, and it just became one of those sensational things about the Roaring Twenties. We also talked about the Great Migration and that this was the first time that large numbers of African Americans left the South for jobs in the North. As far as people of the Roaring Twenties, we talked about most of these already. You've got F. Scott Fitzgerald, the author of The Great Gatsby. Henry Ford, course, invents the Model T and revolutionizes the automobile industry. One of the key things to remember about Henry Ford is not just the fact that he used the Model T, but also the assembly line process that he innovated and adapted for the automobile industry. So know that one about him as well. Just talked about Scopes and Harding. Calvin Coolidge was the other president of the 20s, and so on. So there are some of the famous people that hopefully sound familiar to you. All right, moving on to the Great Depression. So remember that saying, what goes up must come down. And so that kind of carefree attitude of the 20s has repercussions. And at the very end, the stock market crashes and the Great Depression begins, but there was a lot more going on behind the scenes. So we are going to fill out this diagram together, and these are drag and droppable slides that you can add in. So let's focus on the causes of the Great Depression. So if you remember, we wrote a DVQ essay over this. It seems like a very long time ago, but hopefully these things sound familiar to you. There was over speculation on the stock market. Of course, the crash itself signifies the beginning. There were high tariffs. The Federal Reserve was having a tight money policy. There was overproduction of goods without a lot of people to buy them, under consumption. And all of these things together lead to the Great Depression. Now, there's lots of factors that led to it, but these are the ones we're going to focus on for our review. What were some of the characteristics of life during the Great Depression? Best answer is this one right here. We're looking at production decreases. A lot of businesses are going to close their doors. People are going to lose jobs. Unemployment skyrockets. People can't pay their mortgages because they don't have jobs. And so mortgage foreclosures then happen, and the banks take back the homes, and then the banking system is going to collapse, and that leads to the bank runs. And so this just was kind of this domino effect of bad following bad, following bad, following bad, making this depression bigger and deeper as each following event happened. Now, who was president at the time this happened? That would be Herbert Hoover. And I think a lot of history teachers will say the same thing. When you think Hoover vacuums. Vacuums suck, and so did Hoover. He really just froze. I usually explain it to my students kind of like a deer in headlights. He just didn't understand the severity of the situation, and didn't understand the severity of the situation. He had this belief in rugged individualism that, hey, yeah, I mean, this is really bad, but it's up to you to fix it. It's not the government's job. He's going to pass the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, though. The bonus army happens during Hoover's presidency. These were the World War I veterans who were promised a payment, a bonus for their service in World War I. And they wanted that money early because they needed it to survive the Depression. So they marched to Washington. They camped out outside the White House, and they basically were there kind of protesting, living in these Hoovervilles, wanting that money early. They weren't the only ones living in Hoovervilles. As the unemployment rose and homelessness rose, more and more people were living in these makeshift shanty towns that they named after the president that they felt was doing nothing to help them. So you had Hoovervilles, you had Hoover blankets, Hoover flags. The name Hoover was not a compliment during the Great Depression. When it's time for him to run for re-election, obviously he does not win. The next president is Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now remember, there's two Roosevelts. This one is Franklin D. Roosevelt. And so he is going to come in with his New Deal plan to try to fix the Great Depression. So we're going to start with the first New Deal. And his New Deal policies are going to be categorized as either relief, recovery, or reform. And so let's kind of see what FDR does first. He comes in first, and the first thing that he's going to focus on are the banks, the bank runs, the banks shutting down. He kind of calls a timeout, and he calls a bank holiday, and he shuts down every bank in the United States so that everyone can catch their breath and stop panicking. And as the government kind of goes through and certifies the banks, he allows the strong banks to reopen. And eventually we will talk about the FDIC, which was part of one of his New Deal programs that we'll talk about on the next slide. Now, his first 100 days in office, he is just rolling programs out. So some other programs that we are going to see are going to be these relief programs, the CCC and the WPA that we'll talk about more in a moment. Also, you have these recovery programs right here. The National Recovery Administration, the Codes of Fair Practice, and the AAA. So FDR is very busy and cranking out all of these New Deal programs. Eventually, we'll have the second New Deal, that was going to provide some more long-term and permanent relief. The initial part of the New Deal was to stop the bleeding, provide instant relief, fix immediate things for people. Now, with this second New Deal, FDR is going to focus on more sustainable long-term programs, permanent programs to assist Americans. And so we are going to talk about the Social Security Act. We're also talking about the Works Progress Administration. And we're talking about the Labor Wagner Act. We're going to talk about all of these programs in more detail on the next slide. Now, looking at life during the Great Depression, one of the other events that happens at the same time is the Dust Bowl, the great drought that hits the Great Plains. And so these farmers who were already struggling due to the effects of the Great Depression now sink even further into trouble with the great drought of the Dust Bowl. There are also popular culture that happens during this time period. John Steinbeck is a famous author. He writes The Grapes of Wrath. And you have Dorothea Lange, who travels America taking iconic images and photographs of average Americans during the Great Depression. And a lot of the primary sources and images that we have of this time period are her work. And there's also the WPA artists who travel the country to entertain Americans during this time period. So that is the Great Depression and the New Deal in an overview, but we are going to dig a little deeper into FDR and his New Deal programs on the next slide. All right, so here we go. For the sake of time and me typing, I've kind of built this in as a drag and drop for myself, so your screen may look a little different, but if I tried to type all of this and instruct at the same time, it would get a little confusing. So here are some things that I want you to remember about the New Deal. The New Deal was also called, or kind of nicknamed, alphabet soup because of all, good night, there you go, because of all of the abbreviations and letters. This is also going to be based on relief, recovery, and reform. So if you hear the 3 R's, this is how the New Deal programs would be categorized during this time. Again, relief being just that immediate things, like if you cut your arm, you need to put a Band-Aid on it right away. And then recovery would be maybe needs a little bit more time, a little bit of extra assistance to it. And then reform needed long-term permanent change in order to solve those issues. So let's kind of sort these out a little bit and go over some of the key parts of the New Deal. All right, so first up, we're going to have the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And I'm going to drag this one over. There we go. And talk about it. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, agriculture, that's the farmers. And so again, the farmers had a unique set of problems during this time period. So the main goal of the AAA was to stabilize farm prices. And so this is going to sound a little crazy, but the AAA actually paid farmers to not plant crops or to reduce the sizes of their herds in order to increase market prices. You know, the law of supply and demand. If you decrease the supply, then the price will go up. So the farmers were still getting paid, but they were also stabilizing the market at the same time. This also is the first time we see government subsidies, and that becomes a permanent fixture for farmers in the United States. We're going to move down this column, the first New Deal. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, is next. The Tennessee River Valley was one of the poorest areas in the United States before the Great Depression. So they were especially hard hit. So the government is going to come in and pay to have dams built along the Tennessee River to control flooding, but this does a lot of good things. It created jobs in that area for people to work along the dams, but it also, with the dams, creates hydroelectric power, bringing electricity to that area and that region for the first time. All right, next up, the Federal Emergency Relief Agency. And so this is going to come in and this one over, give direct aid, focusing on the urban poor. So the lower class poor people in the city areas, usually in the form of unskilled job. And an unskilled job is just a job that doesn't require previous knowledge or training, that anyone could walk in and complete that job. And that's what people needed. They needed jobs desperately during the Great Depression. And the last program for the first New Deal is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. And this one was a little unique. This one was specifically for young men aged 18 to 25. And they would go to the Civilian Conservation Corps. They were given free housing, free food, and clothing. And they would train them. And then the young men would be sent out across the country, building roads, building parks, working in the national parks. And they got paid $35 a month. But 30 of that dollars had to be sent home to their families. And I know some of you are probably thinking, they only got left with $5 a month, but most of their basic needs were being taken care of. And during this time period, that was a considerable amount of money. Programs that you need to know for STAR from the second New Deal would be the Works Progress Administration. And so this is going to be the building, it couldn't compete with private industry, so it needed to be government projects. So government buildings like post offices, bridges, schools, highways, parks. And what was unique about the WPA is it also gave work to out-of-work artists like writers, theaters, directors, musicians. They would travel the country and put on performances. Painters would be paid to paint murals on the sides of buildings. So it really was trying to help just out of the box groups of workers too, not just your average everyday workers. One of the permanent contributions of the New Deal was Social Security Act. Social Security is still around today. And what it is, it's guaranteed pensions or retirement payments. It's also unemployment insurance and assistance for dependent children and disabled persons. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is also still in existence today. If you go to the bank or go to any ATM, you're going to see a sticker somewhere on there that says FDIC. And literally, it was insurance for your bank accounts. What was happening at the start of the Great Depression was people ran to the bank and the banks were saying, sorry, I don't have your money. It's gone. That can't happen anymore. The government insures your bank accounts up to a certain limit. And then, so if there's ever a financial catastrophe, your money isn't gone. It's protected by the FDIC. And then lastly, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is there to provide oversight of stock market trading so that there can't be wild, out of control speculation like there was at the beginning of the Great Depression, where people weren't having to pay the full value of stocks or just any issues and problems that could take place during the trades on the stock market. So again, this is the New Deal, aka alphabet soup. These programs would all be either part of relief, recovery, or reform by President Franklin D. Roosevelt during the Great Depression. On the next slide, again, is just more vocabulary for the Great Depression. And I highly encourage you, maybe if you're not familiar, if none of this is ringing any bells, set up a Quizlet, make some flashcards to help refresh your memory over these items. But a lot of these are the things that we already went through in our review lesson today.